think that the greatest curse that hangs over our age is pessimism. Pessimism is far more dangerous than anything, right? Ideologically, right? You can talk about people thinking capitalism is a great system, or you can talk about people, having illusions about how the world works. But when people are pessimistic, when they don't believe that tomorrow is going to be better than the previous day, when they don't think that waking up in the morning is going to give them something hopeful to look forward to, that is the most dangerous feeling. And I think pessimism is hanging over the United States of America right now like you wouldn't believe. People are so afraid. You look at the suicide rate in the United States right now. You look at the opioid addiction rate in the United States. This is pessimism hanging over U.S. society. And, I've talked a lot about ancient Rome. I've talked about, the Roman Empire. I've talked about how the Roman Empire was based on the economic system of slavery. Slavery is a system where people own other people. And it's a pretty inefficient system, right? And the reason for it is simple. What motivation does a slave have to do any work? Not much. The master says, work harder or I will beat you, or work harder or I'll deprive you of food. But other than avoiding punishment, the slave really has no incentive to do anything. And the more slaves you get, the harder it is to keep making them work, right? And pretty soon you're going to have a slave who tells the other slave what to do. And then pretty soon you're going to have a slave who tells the slave what to do. It's a very, very inefficient way of doing things. And the Roman Empire, the bigger it got with its slave economic system, it became more and more inefficient. Their ability to grow crops vastly decreased. Their ability to produce goods and metal vastly decreased. Their ability to extract minerals from the ground, it vastly went down. The bigger the Roman Empire got, the more and more inefficient it became, because this system of slavery was outmoded. And there were a lot of countries that were popping up that had a more efficient system called feudalism. In feudalism, every peasant gets their little piece of land, and then they pay their obligation to the landlord, but then they get to keep what's left over. Far more efficient. They want to produce as much as they can so they can keep as much as they can. But the Romans, of course, were keeping their slave system, and the only way they could maintain it was going around to other peoples and other nations, plundering them and stealing what they had, and keeping it for themselves. And so they were a reactionary empire. They were holding back historical progress. They were keeping intact an economic order that was no longer progressive. They were holding back history. It was a pessimistic empire. And among the Romans, there were two trends of thinking. Most Romans were what you could call hedonists. And now a hedonist is somebody who, lives for pleasure. Most Romans, they would go to gladiatorial shows and bet, on the fighters. Most Romans would, they took pleasure in watching people being eaten by lions in the Colosseum. It was really common. They would have parties and stuff their faces full of food, and then they would have slaves with really long feathers to stuff them down their throats so they could vomit it all up and then go eat some more. This is at a time when most people around the world, were malnourished. So do you think people acting that way? That was most Romans. Most Romans were hedonists. But you got another trend of Romans they called the Stoicists. And the Stoicists did the opposite. The Stoicists, for example, they tended to starve themselves because they wanted to have less, and they wanted to have a spiritual experience by starving themselves. The Stoicists would take hallucinogenic drugs and mushrooms and try to space out. The Stoicists, they were famous for paying lots of money to see lectures by these philosophers who telling them that they should live less and have less. The Stoicists, they were known to whip and flog themselves. They were known to worship different gods from around the empire. And these were the two trends. You could be a hedonist, but if you were just smart enough to not just be purely living for pleasure, you could be a Stoicist. You could be a sadist or you could be a masochist. But it was all about destruction. And I've talked a lot about Michael Parenti's beautiful book about Julius Caesar and how Julius Caesar represented a completely different trend, the city-building tendency. Julius Caesar believed that the Roman Empire needed to completely adjust its relationship with history. He wanted to grant freedom to all kinds of different people that were enslaved. He wanted to give citizenship to people throughout the empire. I was reflecting on Julius Caesar and how he wanted to turn the various cities throughout the empire, like Alexandria and different capitals, in Gaul and elsewhere, He wanted to turn them into prosperous centers of trade. And I thought, it's funny. Julius Caesar was pretty much advocating a 73 BC version of the One Belt, One Road initiative. He was trying to transform the way the Roman Empire operated. He wanted the Roman Empire to be a force of progress around the world. He wanted to be lifting up people, empowering whole countries and nations, letting them be part, letting them have citizenship. He also wanted to empower the citizens within Rome. He was a champion of the proletarians. The proletarians, right? Who are the proletarians? Those are people that weren't slaves. They weren't owned by anybody else, but they didn't have any property. They had to rent where they lived. They were craftsmen. They sold their labor power. And Julius Caesar was loved by the proletarians. And Julius Caesar, of course, we know what happened. We learned about it from William Shakespeare. He was stabbed to death. And those greedy Roman senators who owned huge tracts of land, on some level, they probably knew that their empire needed to start changing the way it operated. But they were too greedy in the short term. They wanted so much in that moment. And they saw Julius Caesar, who was imposing taxes on them, who was talking about redistributing land. They saw him as a threat. So they stabbed to death the only person who could have saved their empire because they were in love with their own profits. There's the play by William Shakespeare. Michael Parenti in his book is very critical of that play. But it's interesting because if you read the play by William Shakespeare, Shakespeare, it seems in the play, is kind of dealing with the human relationship with power and authority. At the beginning of the play, Mark Antony, Brutus, they all get together and they kill Julius Caesar. But then they spend the rest of the play trying to figure out if they did the right thing. They spend the play trying to figure out if it was worth it or not to kill Julius Caesar. And they're debating it among themselves. They have the line about the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves, who are underlings. And how on some level, Julius Caesar, despite the fact that they perceived him as a tyrant, was probably a good man. That's underlying it. And Shakespeare, of course, never went to Italy. He never lived in ancient Rome. He was writing about the human relationship with power and authority. And it's kind of the question of state power, right? We know we need a government on some level, but we all hate the government, right? A child knows they need their parents, but on some level hates their parents. This is a natural part of the human condition that Shakespeare was writing about. I also thought it's worth mentioning, that the book, The City of God, one of the key texts of the Christian religion, is written from a very defensive standpoint because the early Christian church was a little bit embarrassed about the fact that almost simultaneously, when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, it collapsed. And that was a little bit of a hard selling point. If you're going around the world trying to convince people to adopt your religion, and some big, huge empire adopted your religion and then collapsed, it's not a really good selling point. But it's interesting, if you read The City of God, which is still a very important text, in the development of Christian theology, if you look at it, you kind of don't even, the book's not even necessary. Right? Because if you look at the teachings of Jesus, Jesus was not advising people on how to go out and build mighty empires that conquer and destroy people. Jesus said the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So the fact that the Roman Empire would collapse, an empire based on slavery and exploitation and killing would collapse when they adopted the teachings of Jesus, makes kind of perfect sense. There's no reason to be defensive about it at all, I think. It's pretty amusing. Everyone in the United States thinks they're an expert on communism. You know what I'm saying? Isn't it really annoying? Everyone in the United States thinks they're an expert on communism. I'll never forget a conversation I had one time. I was in Cleveland. I was selling a newspaper. Somebody walked up to me and he said, I have read every word that Karl Marx has ever written. I have read every word that Karl Marx has ever written, and I know that it doesn't work. I have studied it more than you have. You think you know it, but I read every word that Karl Marx ever wrote. I was kind of, wow. That's a lot of reading you did, And I said, well, I know you think Marx was wrong about socialism, but do you think he was wrong about dialectical materialism? And the guy looked at me and said, what are you talking about? I said, you read every word of Karl Marx? You never heard of dialectical? He's like, you're using fancy words trying to look like you know more than I do, but people don't know anything, right? People always say, socialism does not work. Well, somebody should have asked Yuri Gagarin, the first man in outer space, how he managed to get into space with something that didn't work. How did the shuttle that didn't work get him into space? Somebody should have asked the people living in Germany toward the end of the Second World War how an army that didn't work managed to drive in, defeat the Nazis, and unfurl the hammer sickle flag. If it didn't work, right? People should ask, why half the steel in the world today is made in these state-controlled industries of China. If socialism doesn't work, all this steel, how are they doing it? I mean, it just doesn't work, right? How is Huawei, the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, making some of the best phones, better than Apple? Apple's desperate to get them pushed off the market. How is this working? It doesn't work, right? We learned in school it doesn't work. Well, I mean, there's all this evidence of socialism working pretty well, but somehow it just doesn't work, right? Everyone's an expert. Everyone's an expert. And it's amusing, you talk about Cuba, and the fact that Cuba is a very small island, and yet it's known all over the world for its achievements in terms of healthcare and medical volunteers and literacy volunteers that they send all over the world. You can compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic or Haiti or any of the countries in that area, and it's amazing what they have accomplished. The reputation that Cuba has is based on real solid achievements in that area. We talk about the situation on the border, right, where there are immigrants pouring into this country, refugees. Where are they fleeing from? They're fleeing from Honduras, a free market country. They're fleeing from Guatemala, a free market country. You don't hear about many people fleeing from Nicaragua, where the Sandinista government has made huge achievements in reducing poverty and providing health care to people. And there's so much evidence of socialism being quite successful in raising people out of poverty. There's so many examples of capitalism completely collapsing and destroying people's lives, but yet people stick to this narrative that they have. Socialism doesn't work. It just doesn't work, right? I mean, everyone knows it. You almost want to say, whenever someone says everyone knows in front of something, you can almost guess that they're lying, right? Everyone knows. Everyone knows. Well, if everyone knows it in this society, it's a good hint that it's probably wrong. This isn't exactly a true story, but it's a story that I know very, very similar things have definitely happened. So I'm gonna give you this before I close. So you can imagine a young man, right? He lives in the heartland of the United States. He's graduated from college. He's got a load of student debt. He's working full-time job, but it's not enough that he can live on his own. He's still living with the parents. Parents aren't too happy about that. And they've noticed that their son, who usually was just all over the computer and all that, he starts reading. He's always reading books. And the last year, he's gotten really, really literary. He's reading a lot. He's not talking as much, but he's reading a lot. They're a little bit worried about their son. So they say, you know what, on Saturday night, we're going to take him out to dinner. We're going to take John out to dinner, find out how he's doing. Maybe he can talk to him about possibly getting a better job, getting into a better life situation. We're going to take John out to dinner on Saturday night. So Saturday evening rolls around. They get a reservation at a decent restaurant. Mother walks up to John's room, knocks up on the door. John, we're going to head to the restaurant. John says, Mom, I'm reading a really good book. If you could just give me a few more minutes, I just want to finish reading this book. She says, okay. Goes away. Comes back to the door of the room. All right, John, you ready to get going? He says, Mom, I am at the most exciting part of this book. The hero is in so much trouble, and I just got to see how this book ends. I can't. She says, okay. She's a little bit frustrated. Goes away. Comes back. All right, John, you finished with your book. We got to get going. We got a reservation. They've got an evening plan. It's like, I'm almost done. Just one more page. It's a short book. I'm almost done. She said, okay. Comes back. John, hurry up. We got to get going. What's going on here? All right, I'm almost done. A couple of minutes later, he comes flying out of the bedroom. He's all dressed. He's ready to go. He's like, all right, let's go to dinner. So they go to dinner. They get to the restaurant. They're in the restaurant, and they're sitting there across from each other. Father's sitting there, the mother's sitting there, John's sitting there. The father just making conversation. He says, so John, what was this book that you were reading that was so exciting, that you just couldn't get away from it? Was it science fiction? I know you really like science fiction, don't you? He says, no, it wasn't really science fiction, but it kind of reminded me of science fiction. A little more science fact than science fiction. I said, okay, John. I said, what were you reading? And he says, brought it with me, the Communist Manifesto. Of course, this is a Trump-supporting, rather conservative family, so their jaws kind of drop there in the restaurant, and they're looking over their shoulder. People see them, oh my goodness. And they said, John, you're reading the Communist Manifesto. I mean, what in the world? I mean, we figured you were reading like an action novel or something. What is this? He said, well, this is the most exciting story I've ever read. He says, really? He says, yeah. He says, the part where it says, a class of laborers who live so long as they find work and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and all the fluctuations of the market. He's like, that reminded me of my job at the Amazon warehouse and how my boss is trying to drive me to work harder and ripping me off. And then when I read the part about how the modern laborer, instead of rising with the process of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than the population and the wealth. That made me think about how they're always trying to replace workers with machines. We're pretty close to having self-driving cars. Imagine how many people are going to lose their jobs when we have self-driving cars. These capitalists, they're really good at inventing new technology to make better profits, but it only leads to people getting poorer and poorer. And we talked about pauperism. I thought about how the roads in our neighborhood are crumbling. I thought how the standard of living is going down. I thought about all the student debt me and people my age have hanging over their heads. And then I read the part where it says the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chasing the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. I thought about how Uncle John lost his job in the factory because they sent it to another country where people were working for less, and how they've got us all competing all over the world. Who will work for the lowest wages? Who will accept the worst conditions? I read about how it compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates the world after its own image. And when I read that part, I thought about how people are pouring into this country from Honduras. People are pouring into this country from Guatemala. People are pouring in from Haiti. Why? Because the same thing that they're doing to us now, impoverishing and deindustrializing our country, they've been doing to people all over the world for years, driving people into poverty to create one giant global economy. And that's why I couldn't put the book down. This is a book about us. This is a book about our community. I couldn't put it down. I had to get to the part where it said the first step in the revolution by the working class, the proletariat, is to raise itself to the position of the ruling class and win the battle for democracy. And that meant that we're going to have a government someday that fights for us and not for the billionaires. We're going to have people in Washington, D.C. who fight against the billionaire bankers and fight for working people like us. And I read the part where it said the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize the instruments of production in the hands of the state, of the organized proletariat as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces in society as rapidly as possible. I thought about what that could mean. Finding all the young men like me that are stuck in low-wage jobs, stuck in, living like a teenager into your adulthood, humiliated by student debt, degraded all the time. Talked about what it'll meant to mobilize us and get us working, get us making new breakthroughs in science, get us building high-speed railways. In China, they got these trains that are amazingly fast. They can go from Los Angeles to New York City in a couple hours. We could have that here if it weren't for the capitalists, right? I read about how we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. I will have a government that will not see us simply as tools to make profits for corporations, but see every single person in the country as an asset, someone who could be unleashed to build a better country. Every person could be put to work to build a better society. And that's why I couldn't stop until I got to the last paragraph, where it said the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, and they have a world to win. And it might be a long shot. It seems like a long shot, right? People in the United States have heard nothing from the time they were little kids up until adulthood that communism is evil, communism doesn't work. But Joe McCarthy drank himself to death. And Mao came down from the mountain. And A does not equal A. And you never step into the same river twice. And this is the best book I have ever read. And maybe I'm putting it down for now, but I will never put this book down. This is the most beautiful story I've ever read, and I am going to fight and die to make it come true.